It is a pleasure to be with you. I'm so grateful to be here. And I'm grateful to be in a series that's talking about generations. I was thinking about, the generations around my life. You know, I grew up in a different millennium even than most of you. And we had one television channel, and my heroes, because we went to church all the time, my heroes were Roy Rogers and several Bible characters. I love the Bible characters. I particularly like Solomon. I remember doing role plays about Solomon. He was one of my favorites because he was a younger brother who became king, which I like to remind my older brother about from time to time. And I love that situation where in the book of Kings, he goes into a situation where he goes to Gibeon to pray because he's getting ready to be the king. And he has a dream, and in that dream, God asks him what he wants. And he says, I just want a discerning heart so I can lead my people. And God is so pleased with him that he gives him a discerning heart. He gives him wisdom. But he also gives him the things he didn't ask for, like riches and power. And it says in that story that you are going to be one of the greatest kings ever. There'll be none other like you as long as you follow me and follow my ways. And then I remember as early as the 4th or 5th grade, we all studied the book of Proverbs. It's a book that Solomon wrote, the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, so you can attain wisdom and discipline and prudence and understand the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and discipline. That was a great book to study. I loved him because he was a tremendous builder. You know, he built the temple. His father wasn't allowed to. And the very Shekinah glory of God came into that temple. He saw it with his own eyes. He built palaces. He built fortresses. He got new land and expanded the territory. He really had a great, great kingdom. And he's so wise. And you can read about it in those 31 chapters of the book of Proverbs. And then I went to Ecclesiastes. And I had to knock him off my pedestal because it's 12 depressing chapters by a bitter old man. And that's my text for the day. Some people do a series, 5 or 6, 7, 8, 10 sermons. I said, I think 20 minutes is enough for the whole book of Ecclesiastes. You know, what's so interesting about that situation, if you've ever read it, he says, the words of the teacher or the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem, meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher, utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. What does a man gain from all his labor at which he toils under the sun? Generations come and generations go, but the earth remains forever. Ooh, that's hard to take. I wouldn't read it in the afternoon for light reading if I were you. I'll tell you what it says. He talks in there a lot about the fact that he was given knowledge. He had remarkable knowledge on a whole host of subjects. He made Leonardo da Vinci look like a piker. In today's world, he'd have 10 PhDs. He could talk about anything. He had fame. People came from all over the world to sit at his feet and listen to him. I think all that knowledge and all that fame may have been a bit too much of a PR job that he began to believe. Because as he continues and he does more and more things, it begins to stray away from the things that God wants him to do. I mentioned that he was going to get wealth. Just his annual tributes alone were 25 tons of gold. I tried to work how much that was, and my phone calculator couldn't handle it. He had silver beyond reckoning. He had all kinds of other things. He had so much wealth, and he spent it on himself and the things that interested him, but not so much the things that interested his people. And he spent it all, and they had to raise taxes and create burdens to the people, so much so that by the time of his death, by the time of the writing of this book, he was an onerous problem to his people. And then that whole thing about a spouse. You know, I'm in a young adult men's Bible study. They didn't tell me I was going to be the oldest one in that study when I agreed to go in. And often we have single young men in there, and frequently they have a request, pray for me that I can find a good woman for a wife. Well, Solomon found one. Actually, he found 700. And then he had 300 concubines, which, if you don't know, a concubine is kind of sort of like a wife, but not exactly. I've tried to kind of figure that whole flow chart out with all those wives and concubines. It's beyond my reckoning. I don't even understand what was going on there. And the more you read about Solomon, I think the less you'll understand too. Because one of the very big problems with Solomon in the wives that he brought in and his friends is they brought their pagan idols, their pagan religions. They were even building idols and altars inside the temple itself. The very thing he promised God he would not do, the very thing God says, I will bless you forever if you do this, if you follow me and remain pure to my... He didn't get that accomplished through these wives. And it brought heresy, it brought apostasy, not only to the city of Jerusalem, but it brought it into the whole nation. And they never got really rid of it until they were taken into captivity. Here he was, at the end of his life, a king with ultimate power. And as he looked around, he saw that he had a son that was not sharp enough to handle the reins of power. And he saw people in the wings waiting just to rip his kingdom apart for their own use. And that's frankly what happened. And that's why he's there, old, useless, lonely, replaced, afraid that he will be forgotten by the generations. I probably wouldn't even read this book were it not for the fact there are two chapters, or two verses at the very end of the last chapter. And this is what it says. After complaining, after moaning and groaning, after giving us insight to his failures, he says this, now all has been heard, and here's the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. Now that's an abrupt change of heart. It's also an admission that he made bad choices. I begin to love Solomon again because even though he made so many bad choices, he's basically saying you're never too old to start making good choices. I appreciate that. And something he said a little bit earlier in the 9th chapter about do whatever your hand finds to do with all your might. It brings clarification to that. What he's really saying, do whatever you do, but do it with all your might as a service to God. Now, that's Old Testament speak with those words, fear God, reverence God, etc., etc. But if we go to the New Testament and we begin to think about the kinds of things that Jesus said and others, I must be about my Father's business. That's just another way of saying I'm making my decisions based on what my Father wants me to do. Don't bury your talents in the ground. You've been gifted with all kinds of talents and responsibility. Use them to honor your master. Let your light shine. Don't hide it under a bushel. You are the salt of the earth. Flavor and preserve the environment around you. Be a steward of God. Be a servant of the master. Solomon missed that for most of his life. But he gives us the 13th and 14th verses so we know that it is not too late for us to make changes. He wants us to know that everything you do is something that can honor God and be used by him. That's a great thing to know. It's a great thing to understand. It's talking about stewardship. It's talking about service. And I think people say, oh, well, that stuff is when I make big decisions. But it's not just the big decisions. Sometimes little decisions end up having such big ramifications that you can't imagine or believe. I was thinking about preaching for you this Sunday, and I was remembering when I came. I came in 1975. I got married on the 31st day of May. And in 2 weeks, I had turned 22, moved into my apartment with my wife, and been put to work doing a wedding the day before you started paying me, okay? And it was just really interesting to be here, to be so young. I love going to coffee breaks when we had the staff together on money, and often people from the church would come through that I didn't know. They certainly weren't in my sphere as a youth minister. I'll never forget this couple. Their name was Frank and Helen Bradley. Little old couple, very, very jolly. He was kind of interesting to me because he had a tattoo. He's the first person I ever knew that had a tattoo. Now, I live in California. Everybody has a tattoo in my church in California now, except me, or a tattoo in a place that you can see anyway, okay? And he just was quirky to me. So I got to talking with him, and I don't know, somewhere 2 years into the mix, I don't know, I found out that at one point in their life, they saw a family of children who had trouble getting to church. You know, some of them came once in a while, they were very irregular, and they decided that they were going to pick these kids up and bring them to church, whether they wanted to come or not. And they started doing that. Now, there was a lot of kids. I don't know how they got them all in the car, and I don't think they all came. I certainly know that all of them didn't stick. As a matter of fact, I think mostly it was 2 sisters from that family that stuck. And they started coming. They went to youth group here. They stayed here. They got married here. They raised their families here. And all because that family decided to pick them up in the car. Now, the oldest sister, her name was Hope. And it was interesting to me that in her life, besides being a wife and a mother and all of that, and a good church worker, she decided to get in on the ground floor of starting Christian Nursing Home. Now, she didn't have the grand vision. She wasn't the up first person. She was the boots on the ground person, or one of many, by the way, I might add. She's the person who would end up bathing and caring and cleaning and, well, just doing all kinds of things that elderly people need who are well beyond being able to care for themselves. And she did that for decade after decade after decade. It made a difference, too, to the ministry of that home because she was one of many people who had that ministry commitment. It made the home great. Matter of fact, it caused them to replicate that home in other places. And decades later, when our family was faced with finding a place for our mother to go when she needed to be cared for in that way, there was no question about where. She went to the Carmi Christian Nursing Home. Isn't it odd that when we make decisions for Christ, whether it's picking somebody up or deciding to take a ministry where we can honor God with our service, and it's like throwing a rock and there's ripples that come down and help? And it even went so far as Southern Illinois to bless me so far away from this place. Her sister went with the Christian education mode. Maybe that's because she had little kids. I don't really know. But I do know this. Shortly after she started working in Christian Ed in the church here as a volunteer, there was an older lady in the church. She had no children. I won't mention her name, but she does have a library named after her about 2 miles away from here. She had no children. And yet, she took this person under her wings. I don't know what all she did because I didn't really meet either of them until decades later. And by the time I did meet this woman decades later, she ran the junior high vacation Bible school program. She was a superintendent of the high school Sunday school department. She and her husband were youth sponsors, and she raised all the money that we needed for Good News, and they were Good News sponsors. She did a lot, particularly a lot that affected my life. We often did things with senior citizens at that time with our youth, and so we were often together having events at this and that, the other. And that lady came over and she grabbed me. And she said to me, when she grabbed this other lady, she goes, "Evelyn is my Timothy." What she's saying is, like Paul looked at Timothy and mentored him and gave him the things he needed to put his life into focus, that she had mentored this woman and given her the things that she needed to put her life into focus. I thought that was really strange, that this woman who has a library in her honor where thousands of people have studied would look at this other woman and say, that's my Timothy. But she told me that probably 6, 7, 8 times at different times along the way. And that was her claim to fame as far as she's concerned. Because she made a decision to do something that really nobody knew anything about and just do everything she could to help this person grow. I was probably a little more surprised that she would say that, given the fact for my own personal thing, Lincoln Christian College had been very important to me. I was thinking about it, and if the college had not sent a certain minister to my home church when I was between my sophomore and junior year of high school, there is no way that I would have gone into ministry. There's no way. Well, I wouldn't be here preaching for you now. You'd just be sitting here for 20 minutes alone, in the silence, in the dark. The concert tonight would be shorter. But that's what happened. I mentioned it to a friend of mine. His name's Tim Searby. You may not know this, but he and I grew up together. We went to the same home church. He's much older and led a sort of dissolute and wayward life. But I said, and I mentioned the minister by name, if he had not come that summer, do you think that you would have ever entered into the church and parachurch ministries that you've given your whole life to? And he says, well, absolutely not. No way. I would never have got there had that one person not came and done that. Yesterday afternoon, I was sitting and talking with Tracy Thomas. Now, you know Tracy Thomas is a beloved youth minister who's here for 10 years. And I was aware that he's here, but since I was long gone, I didn't really know him. I know Tracy Thomas as a hospice chaplain who worked with the organization in Southern Illinois that took care of my mother and my family in the last days of my mother's life. That's how I know Tracy Thomas. It's amazing the way when we make decisions and when we help people and we do things in the name of the kingdom, that it goes to benefit us. And it goes from person to person to person, but also from generation to generation to generation. It's not something we talk about in a historical context. It's something we talk about right now, the things that we can do and should be doing as the people of God. I think about Lincoln Christian College, and I knew Mr. Hargrove quite well. Everybody just assumes that, it was an easy piece of cake for Mr. Hargrove to start the college. And while there was a wave of sentiment to do that, it was not given that it was going to really happen. There were people for it and there were people who weren't for it. But he provided the vision. There are a lot of people who came behind him to provide, the boots on the ground to make it happen. But there came a Fisher cut bait moment when somebody had to stand up and say, I move that we allow our minister enough time from his regular duties to start a Christian college. Guess who did that? My tattooed friend, Frank Bradley. He'll pick up kids in his car, but he'll also stand up and lead the charge and spur people on about things that need to be done. We come down, if we look at Ecclesiastes, it just comes down to this. In life, we need to make decisions every day about everything we do. You can make all of your decisions about what will make me happy. And I think that's what Solomon did. And it made him miserable. Or we can make decisions based on what we think will honor God. We don't always know. Sometimes we have to guess. But we make our decisions based on what we think will honor God. And God has a way of taking the gifts that we get, just like taking a few loaves and some fishes and multiplying and doing something great, taking something small like a widow's mite and blessing it and raising it up as an example for all people everywhere. It's an amazing thing, the ripples that happen, that affect us and affect people for generations after generations after generations. And each and every one of us is called to do that simply by fearing God, keeping His commandments, making all of our decisions as a servant, as a steward, as someone who puts what we do in the hands of God and trusts Him to bring it to completion for His glory, His honor. And Solomon says that's what brings eternal happiness and eternal peace.